This video is brought to you by Global Men's Wellness, your 24/7 AI health expert. No copays, waiting rooms, or awkward conversations. Just real answers whenever you need them. Visit globalmenswellness.com to try it free and get your own on-demand concierge-level wellness expert today.
All right, welcome back everyone to the 21st Century Man podcast. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into, well, what I think is one of the most defining aspects of being a man, at least in the traditional sense, fatherhood. We're going to be cracking open chapter 75, same book, The 21st Century Man, and this chapter is aptly titled Fatherhood. And, just to give you guys a roadmap, we're going to be pulling wisdom, as always, from our guide, the medical writer, Armand Bra. So let's just jump right in.
Yeah, and I think one of the most impactful things that Brat does right off the bat is he really kind of reframes, what it means to be a successful man.
Okay.
And it kind of starts off with this quote from Robert Duvall, the actor, and he says, "Not every successful man is a good father, but every good father is a successful man." And, right away it kind of just hits you.
Yep.
We're not talking about just, being able to change a diaper. We're talking about like a fundamental aspect of a man's character.
Right.
And how, how he kind of views his own success and achievement. And, it really kind of makes you think, what is success?
Yeah.
How do you define that?
Exactly. And it's really neat how he, right off the bat, kind of establishes like fatherhood is not some static thing. Like you become a father and that's it.
Right.
He kind of makes it very clear that this is an evolving, experience.
Yeah.
This is something that is lifelong. It morphs, it changes, it continues until, the father's death.
Right.
And so just to kind of unpack that a little bit, like the awe or maybe terror that you experience, when you hold your newborn child for the first time, that's just the beginning.
Yeah.
That is just the overture to this giant symphony of life, right?
Yeah.
And then the symphony continues with the first steps, the school plays, teenage angst, all the way to hopefully, being able to see your children succeed as adults.
Yep.
And just this constant becoming. It's not like, as I said, you put on a hat and suddenly you're a father. It's really ingrained into your identity.
And that, I think, is one of the most crucial things for the listener to consider.
Yeah.
That this is not something that's just ephemeral.
Yeah.
Like it's a fundamental part of who you become.
Right.
And then Brat goes into the kind of remarkable ways in which men report being transformed by this journey.
Exactly. And this is where it gets, I think, really interesting. It's not just, not getting a full night's sleep, which is true, but he kind of goes through all these really positive changes that men kind of go through when they become fathers.
Yeah.
And these are significant. He talks about patience. I mean, anybody who's a parent knows you need that in abundance.
You gotta have it.
Right. And then empathy, understanding, really being able to kind of see the world or see situations through another person's, viewpoint. Yeah. So this is almost like unlocking new capacities within yourself.
Yeah, and one of the fascinating ones that Brat mentions is, an increased self-awareness.
Okay.
Where, fathers start to become aware of their own strengths and weaknesses, perhaps more acutely than they ever were before.
Right.
And this kind of recognition can breed a greater tolerance, not only in themselves and their own flaws, but also, in their children, in everyone.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting, has fatherhood kind of opened up new aspects of your own character that you maybe hadn't really considered?
It really has. And, talk about flexibility, right? Because kids are the kings and queens of curveballs.
Right.
So, as a parent, you're constantly having to adapt. You're constantly having to have plan B and C and D.
Right.
And, Brat also, talks about this kind of increased concern for the world at large, leaving a better planet for your kids. And this can be very motivating for a lot of fathers.
Yeah. I think we kind of connect all these different threads together.
Yeah.
It's like fatherhood becomes this remarkable, catalyst for personal growth across all these different dimensions.
Right.
Brat also mentions an increase in, their emotional capacity, the ability to experience and express emotions that maybe they hadn't tapped into before, including, a very profound, and powerful sense of unconditional love.
Right.
Which for some men, that's a whole new terrain.
Right.
And what's also interesting is that Brat talks about a fundamental shift in priorities. Before kids, careers and personal ambitions are often the primary focus.
Right.
But fatherhood often really recalibrates that entire equation.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
puts family right at the center of the list.
Yeah.
It's a major shift for a lot of men.
It is. It is. And, he also mentions this deep pride that men often feel not only in their children's successes, big or small, but also in their own role, in nurturing them and helping them grow.
Yeah.
And this is an incredible and ongoing reward. He talks about, it's so interesting. He talks about the simple way in which children reintroduce you to the joy of life's simple moments.
Yeah.
It's like they give you permission to kind of see the wonder again.
Yeah.
And, amazingly, he even talks about, health benefits, physical benefits, adopting healthier habits.
Yeah.
He talks about a renewed interest in learning, as you experience, the world again through your children's eyes. It's really neat. So it's like a new operating system gets installed, when you become a dad.
And that's a good analogy. I think this kind of segues into, one of the more practical aspects of how these kind of profound personal changes manifest themselves.
Right.
And the chapter kind of dives into this concept of recalibrating your life, and he focuses specifically on careers.
Mm-hmm.
And Bra, he uses his own life as an example, as a compelling illustration, and talks about his own decision to leave his business career to dedicate himself to writing full time.
Oh, wow.
And this was largely motivated by a desire to be more present in his daughter's life.
Right.
So it really kind of makes you wonder, what kind of choices would fatherhood lead you to make?
That's a huge shift.
It is. And he also talks about other examples like the actor Ewan McGregor, who deliberately reduced his acting commitments.
Right.
Or Robert Reich, who left a very prominent government position.
Right.
And in both instances, they were motivated by that very powerful desire to spend more time with their families. So these are not just like abstract ideas. These are real world examples of men making these really quite dramatic shifts in their careers.
Right. And these are not small names either. These are people at the top of their respective fields.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But while these are kind of high profile examples of these very dramatic career shifts, Bra is very wise in acknowledging that these kind of radical changes are not always feasible.
Right.
They're certainly not always desirable for everyone.
Right.
And he uses a more down to earth example of a postal worker who adjusted his work schedule to better suit his son's needs.
Okay.
So the real point here is not necessarily that you have to quit your job, but that fatherhood can serve as this kind of, impetus to really reevaluate your priorities.
Right.
And make adjustments, both big or small, to better integrate your work and family life.
Right.
It's really about that fundamental reevaluation of your time and energy.
And that's something that every listener can kind of relate to.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this grand thing. It can be something very small. Now, one of the things that, Bra talks about is this concept of why be involved with your teen. A lot of parents kind of go, oh, teenage years, brace yourself. But it's interesting how he really stresses the importance of being involved during this crucial period.
Yeah, and he outlines several really compelling advantages.
Okay.
For example, there's research to suggest that teenagers with involved fathers, they're less likely to engage in early sexual activity.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, he gives the example that, girls who feel closer to their biological fathers, they tend to delay their first sexual experience, and they also tend to have fewer partners.
Oh.
So that's kind of a direct correlation
Wow.
to that protective influence that a father can have.
Okay. So, that's kind of a direct segue to the next benefit that he brings up, and that's this greater autonomy and independence.
Yep.
Bra observes that fathers kind of encourage their teenagers' independence more readily than mothers might.
Yeah.
And I think that's so crucial, right? It's that gentle push, right, to self-reliance.
Right.
Encouraging them to explore, to figure things out on their own.
Yeah.
This is so valuable as they're kind of making that transition to adulthood.
And then there's also, the very strong connection to success later in life.
Okay.
The research done by T.E. Smith, which linked paternal praise to higher educational aspirations, John Snary, who found that strong father-child relationships are predictive of greater academic and career success,
Yeah.
for both sons and daughters, really underscores the long-term impact of an engaged father.
Yeah.
It's really about laying that foundation for their future achievements.
And that's really important for listeners to realize, is that your involvement as a father is not just about the here and now.
Right.
It's about setting them up, for future success.
Absolutely.
Now, Bra also talks about this really important topic, about fathers helping their children develop a more secure gender identity.
Right.
And so can you kind of unpack this a little bit? Why is this so important?
Yeah. Well, Broad explains that when fathers demonstrate, warmth and affection, boys develop a healthier and more confident sense of their own masculinity.
Right.
And girls, in turn, develop a more secure sense of their femininity.
Okay.
And conversely, he cites Neil Coulter's research that boys who have very limited contact with their fathers may actually develop kind of unhealthy dependence on their mothers, which can lead to anxieties about their own masculinity later in life.
Okay.
He even points out that a disproportionately high percentage of boys in prison or involved in gang activity lack fathers.
Wow.
So these are kind of stark, reminders of just how fundamental a father's presence can be in a child's developing sense of self.
Wow, that's really powerful. So, we can really see how just crucial and vital it is for a father to be present in a child's life, and that leads us to the next point, which is mental and physical health, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Brott, he emphasizes that the more positively involved fathers are, the better their children tend to feel about themselves overall.
Right.
Teenagers who report having good relationships with their fathers, and this is regardless of whether they live with their fathers or not.
Right.
They're less likely to experience, emotional and psychological difficulties,
Sure.
and they tend to have better physical health.
Wow.
He gives these concrete examples, like adolescent girls who are actively involved in sports. They're less likely to drop out of school, to experience teenage pregnancy, or to develop eating disorders.
Wow.
So these are not just, isolated incidents. They really point to a larger trend.
And that really leads us to the point about fewer behavioral problems.
Yeah. And Marcia Carlson, who's a researcher at Princeton, her work found that there's a very strong connection between, a high level of paternal involvement and fewer behavioral issues among adolescents.
Okay.
Again, whether the child lives with the father or not.
Right.
And the statistic that Bront shares that adolescents who have less involved fathers are far more likely to have experimented with illegal drugs or alcohol.
Right.
Really kind of highlights this protective element
Right.
that a father can bring to a child's life.
It's almost like a buffer against risky behavior,
Exactly.
And the connection that Brott makes to eating disorders, right? Girls with involved fathers are less likely to develop eating disorders. And it seems like a father's healthy attitude toward a daughter's weight and body image can have a really strong positive influence.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where there's so much, societal pressure to look a certain way.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here is the long-term impact on things like empathy. Brott mentioned several longitudinal studies that have shown that a father's level of involvement during a child's preschool years, is a very strong predictor of how compassionate and understanding those children will be as adults.
Wow.
So, that early engagement really lays the groundwork for their ability to connect with and understand the feelings of others later in life.
That's a huge insight, that these little quote unquote little interactions, can really cast such a long shadow, in their development.
Right.
And then he goes on to talk about, how fathers can, engage in play and attention, and that this can lead to, better popularity, assertiveness, resilience, especially in daughters.
Absolutely. Ross Park, who did research on successful women, consistently found that high levels of paternal support, intellectual stimulation, and clear expectations were a crucial ingredient in their success.
Okay.
And other studies have shown that regardless of gender, children who have warm and loving relationships with their fathers at the age of 5, They tend to have more enduring marriages. They themselves tend to be better parents, and they tend to have closer friendships as adults.
Wow.
So these are really, really, significant life outcomes that are directly tied to that father-child bond.
Yeah.
It really paints a powerful picture of the lasting legacy of involved fatherhood.
It really does. And academically, we can see all the benefits. Kids stay in school longer.
Right.
They have higher test scores, better GPAs, better attendance, greater expectations for college. I mean, across the board.
And it's encouraging to note that life is easier for difficult kids when fathers are more involved.
Right.
They tend to have higher self-esteem. They tend to do better overall.
Right.
So even in situations where maybe the family is not ideal, the father's presence can still be incredibly beneficial.
And finally, Bra talks about how fathers can minimize the effects of divorce.
Right.
And this is so crucial, right? Because unfortunately, divorce is a reality for a lot of families.
It is.
And so even when families separate, a strong and ongoing relationship with the father really helps children cope better, both academically and emotionally.
Yeah.
So even in difficult circumstances, that continued engagement is so, so important.
And I think this whole section really kind of makes this really, really powerful case for the importance of a father during the teenage years.
Right.
And he touches on everything from behavior and health to social skills and academic success. But then the chapter kind of takes this interesting turn into a more honest, perhaps less openly discussed, aspect of fatherhood.
Okay.
And that's what no one wants to admit about fatherhood.
Yeah.
And I think this is where Bra provides a very, very candid perspective.
Okay, let's take off the rose-tinted glasses here.
Exactly.
So what are some of the harsh truths about being a father, especially during those teen years?
Well, he points out that sometimes, maybe even often, fatherhood, and especially those teenage years, it's just not a picnic.
Right.
And he goes as far as to reference Roger Gould's research from way back in the 1970s, which found that this is perhaps the least satisfying time for fathers.
Really?
Yeah.
Well,
So it's kind of a relief,
Yeah.
to know that maybe those feelings of frustration or challenge, are not some kind of personal failing,
Right.
but actually a fairly common experience.
Right. You're not alone if you're feeling that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
Yeah.
and Bra touches on, the inevitable power struggles,
Right.
the headbutting between fathers and sons, as they assert their independence.
Right.
But then he also kind of introduces this interesting perspective of what might be happening for the father during this period, this kind of confrontation, subtle or not, with his own aging.
Wow.
As his teenager stands at the cusp of a world full of possibilities.
Okay, that's a very interesting contrast.
Right. It's this poignant juxtaposition.
So you have this teenager that's experiencing, their physical peak, maybe even sexual peak.
Right.
And then you have the father who's maybe feeling a few aches and pains
Right.
and realizing that some of his paths are more defined now, more narrow. And so that must be a very poignant moment for the father to look back at his own life and how he got to where he is while he sees his children kind of hurtling towards their future.
It's a moment of significant transition.
Yeah.
For both the father and the child.
Yeah.
And Bra kind of acknowledges the difficulties and the potential dissatisfactions that can accompany it.
Yeah.
And then the chapter kind of moves into this other major life stage, and that's your ever-changing relationship with your child as they prepare to leave home,
Right.
and establish their own lives.
And this is a big moment for a lot of parents. I think they have this kind of mixed emotions. They see the freedom that's coming, right?
Yeah.
The empty nest. But they also have a sense of loss.
Yeah.
But the way he talks about this is not as a post-parental stage.
Right.
It's not like it's the end, right? He's basically saying, no, this is the beginning of the longest phase of fatherhood.
Yeah. And that's a really positive way to look at it, this big transition.
It really reframes, how you think about it. It really underscores that your identity as a father doesn't just end when your kid moves out.
Right.
It undergoes this fundamental transformation,
Right.
He talks about this shift from what's largely an involuntary relationship,
Yeah.
based on shared living independence, to a voluntary one,
Right.
based on mutual desire for connection.
Right.
And paradoxically, this shift can actually strengthen the bond in the long run.
Right.
Once the day-to-day demands of parenting ease,
Hmm.
the conscious choice to connect becomes even more meaningful.
And it makes sense, if you know that your children don't have to call you,
Right.
that if they decide to pick up the phone, it means more. And, Bra makes this really good point that once adult children have kind of demonstrated their independence, they actually might feel more comfortable coming back to you for advice and support,
Absolutely.
having proven themselves.
It really changes the dynamic.
Yeah.
It's no longer that teenage pushback against parental authority.
Right.
And Bra points out that this empty nest phase can also be a time to really rediscover and reinvest in your relationship with your partner.
Right.
Have that second honeymoon,
Right.
and also to reevaluate your own individual identity, now that the really intense daily responsibilities of active parenting have kind of lessened.
Right.
It's a time for redefining your role, both as a father and as a partner.
And so how does a father stay involved, right? How does he do this, staying involved with your adult child in a way that respects their independence, but also, maintains the strong connection?
Bra offers some really practical and quite thoughtful advice here.
Okay.
He talks about maintaining a healthy degree of distance.
Yeah.
Honoring their autonomy, but also always making sure that they know you're there.
Right.
If they need you.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about simple things like not being in a rush to sell the family home, keeping in touch on a regular basis, and this one's really important. Ask for advice.
Okay.
It's that subtle role reversal where you seek out their expertise.
Right.
And that can be really powerful in forging a new kind of connection.
Right.
Acknowledging their growth, their competence.
I love that. That's really showing that you respect them.
Right. And then he also talks about being a consultant rather than a fixer.
Right.
So your role is not to necessarily solve their problems, but to offer guidance when sought. You know? And really allowing them the space to face their challenges, to make their own mistakes, and to learn.
Right.
And Bra also stresses the importance of being consistently supportive rather than critical or judgmental.
Right.
Even if, maybe you don't necessarily agree with all their choices,
Right.
That unconditional support really becomes the foundation of this evolving relationship.
So that's a key takeaway. Be supportive.
Yeah.
Be that person that they can rely on that's not going to judge them.
Exactly.
Now, what about this phenomenon of the boomerang generation?
Yeah.
When adult children come back home, and this is something that a lot of families in the 21st century face.
It is. And Brat talks about this, the prevailing societal expectations, about when you move out, when you become independent.
Right.
And he talks about this social clock.
Right.
And the potential for added stress and tension when an adult child's circumstances don't align with that expected timeline.
Right.
So parents might initially be very happy to have their kid back, especially maybe if they're pursuing further education or something like that.
Right.
But the dynamic can get a lot more complex, if it happens later in life,
Right.
or it really disrupts their own plans,
Right.
for their retirement or a more independent, lifestyle.
Right.
So, open communication is really, really key in these kinds of situations.
And he talks about research done by William Aquilino and Khalil Supple that highlights that parental satisfaction with adult children living at home, it's often tied to things like the child's employment status,
Right.
and whether they are a divorced parent returning with a grandchild.
Right.
So that can really change the dynamic if they're financially dependent. If there are grandchildren involved, that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it just underscores the need for really clear communication, well-defined expectations,
Right.
and mutual respect, when adult children return home, just to make that arrangement work, for all parties involved.
And so, this can be a really sensitive area, when your child needs help as a fully independent adult.
Right.
So how does a father navigate this? How do they offer support without overstepping their bounds or undermining their child's autonomy?
Yeah. Well, Brott offers some really, really wise, guidance in this area.
Okay.
First and foremost, he reminds us that fathers, we don't have to fix every problem,
Right.
that our adult children face, and it's perfectly acceptable to acknowledge their difficulties with empathy.
Oh, right.
Sometimes just a simple "that's too bad," can be incredibly supportive.
Right.
And crucially, he points out that our adult children may not even want,
Right.
our help or unsolicited advice.
Right.
And knowing when to step back is just as important as knowing when to step in.
Yeah, exactly.
He advises offering your perspective or advice once, if they ask,
Right.
and then letting it go.
Right.
He really cautions against repeatedly offering unsolicited advice unless there's a real, crisis where your intervention is clearly needed and welcomed.
So, that's a really key point is knowing when to step in and when to
Take control of your health anytime, anywhere. Visit globalmenswellness.com and start your free trial today. Get expert-level answers in seconds, not weeks, without the cost, the wait, or the awkward conversations. Real support on your terms. Visit globalmenswellness.com now.